Before I continue with Jacob's dream sequence, I want to talk a little bit. I mentioned at the beginning of the previous video about the weirdness, the extreme weirdness of Jacob's timeline. We know from later on that Jacob lived to be 147 years old and that he spent the last 17 years of his life in Egypt. So he was 130 when he went down to Egypt. Based on the dates we have for Joseph, we know that Jacob was 91 when Joseph was born. Okay, so Joseph went down into Egypt as a slave when he was 17. He spent time there. He was eventually promoted to Pharaoh at age 30. Of course, we had the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine, and it was the second year of famine. So when Joseph was about 39, that Jacob went down there. And Jacob spent the last 17 years of his life in Egypt. So Jacob dies at 147. The last 17 years of his life are spent in Egypt. 39 years before that, Joseph is born. So Jacob is 91 when Joseph is born. If you and we'll get into the so that's just when Joseph is the 11th of Jacob's sons, and comes at the end of a flurry of birthing activity that occurred for the previous several years before that. So Jacob is 91 when Joseph is born. He's in his 70s when he leaves home. A lot of times when we think about Jacob, it's a little bit unclear exactly how old he was, because the sequence of events of the births of the children, the 12 brothers, well, the 11 brothers, Benjamin is later on, and the one daughter, Dinah. The timeline is extreme. I'll get to that when I get to that, but the timeline is extremely weird and kind of difficult to make sense out of. But we know that Joseph was born. Through simple math, we can determine that Joseph was born when Jacob was 91 years old. And then because he was with Laban for 20 years, we know that he fled home when he was about 70, 71 years old. So a lot of times, so we're talking about a man who's 70-ish, okay, who's leaving home. All right. A lot of times when we think of Jacob and Esau, we think of them being young men, according to our standards of youth, when this is happening, like in their 20s or something. And then when he's working for Laban, he's like in his 40s. He goes on to work for Laban and works for him for 20 years, ends up working for 20 years. And we think that he's like in his 40s or something to work for his women, work for his wives. And that's not all true. He's in his 70s and 80s during this time. Now, he lives to be 147, okay, and their lifespans apparently were still longer than what we're used to in this day and age. So it could be that his aging process was different and that to him, 91 isn't what it is to us, okay? Now, when we get down to Moses, he's going to be 120 when he dies, and we still have a few of those guys who get really long. Well, 120 is not that. I mean, it's more reasonable than 147 or 175 or anything like that. But the military will, when they form as a nation and they create a fighting force, they establish a military. It's going to be made up of every able-bodied man from the age of 20 on up. So their age of maturity, you're old enough to be a soldier in the army when you're 20, which is about what it is here. Okay, where we now have it set to be 18. That, we could you can sign up to be in the military. You're legally an adult. Even honestly, an 18-year-old is not an adult. Okay, an 18-year-old is not in any way, shape, or form mentally or emotionally or socially developed enough to be considered an adult. But legally, an 18-year-old is considered an adult because that's the age where they can go fight and die for their country, basically. That's the age that we settled on. In ancient Israel, it was 20, which isn't a whole lot more than that. I would still say that 20 itself is not really an adult, but by 20, your body is physically capable of doing what it needs to do and fight and reproduce and all that stuff. So physically, your body has matured. Mentally and emotionally, I still think even at 20 you have not, but physically by 20 you have. Anyway, so their age of like, okay, you're a physically formed young adult male if you're 20 years old. was 20, which is about what we would consider that to be true too. I mean, that's not really any different, honestly. So their youth was basically their first 20 years. Okay, and I don't really see anything to indicate that that wasn't that way. That wasn't. You know, I don't really see anything to indicate that that wasn't always the case. When Moses is writing in his day and time, he looks at teenagers probably the same way that we do. He looks at 20-year-old young men as rookies in the army, basically. Joshua, who was the general, like to him, that's you're 20 years old, you're physically able to be a fighter, a soldier, and we probably would say the same. So I don't think that they would look at. I think that their childhood and early development and adolescence and young adulthood were probably the same. I think apparently, and again, I don't really know how to explain this other than just to say, it seems like at this point in time, the aging process was more drawn out. Certainly, we see that before the flood. We even see that for several generations afterwards. The aging process is more drawn out. You can believe whatever you want to believe about that. Maybe that's just not acceptable to you. Maybe it's not. I would say, let's think about some of the things that could make that likely. That could make it more palatable, at least. More agreeable to at least say, okay, this isn't an issue. There would have been fewer germs. There would have been fewer mutations in the DNA sequence, fewer deformities. You know, the farther back you go, the closer you get to a perfect world. We don't think of it in those terms today, but that's how the creation is set up. And so the farther back you go, the fewer mutations there would be in the DNA sequencing, the fewer germs and diseases and viruses. The whole big story for the last year has been this new virus that's never been seen anywhere in the entire world until the end, about 16 months ago, the end of December 2019. This new coronavirus magically appeared on the world stage for the first time in history. So there wouldn't have been anything like that. Think of all the viruses and diseases and bacteria that would have formed in the last 3,000 years or 4,000, 3,600 years, whatever it's been. Mutations in the DNA sequencing. Of course, there would be any pollution. You wouldn't have had chemicals and things in the water and the soil. We read about them digging for water in the soil, so they knew where to find water. They knew where to find good water. They knew where to find and how to take care of their plants. They had to. I mean, they knew food. I talked about how they fought over food and water. We don't fight over food and water. Okay, so these people knew about sustaining themselves, knew about sustaining their lives. And so I just say that maybe their aging process was just slower. Maybe even the climate. We talk about climate change, and we believe obviously in the process of climate change, that the Earth's climate can change, whether or not it's man-made or man-influenced or however. Okay, like maybe the climate was simply different back then. Maybe the Earth's climate. You know, we have these fossils of these huge, gigantic dinosaur creatures that don't exist anymore. It's hard to believe that the Earth's climate could ever have supported those creatures. It can't today. Yeah. This year there was supposed to be another Jurassic World movie that came out. It got delayed, of course, because of COVID. But when I watch those Jurassic movies, those dinosaur movies, it's weird to think that the Earth's, and those are obviously Hollywood versions of them, but it's just the Earth. It's impossible. It's hard to think that the Earth's climate could have ever supported such creatures, and it can't today. It's like, you know, in the Jurassic movies, of course, the dinosaurs are relegated to this one little island, at least until they get loose. But you know, it's like the Earth's climate can't support those things today. You know, whatever conditions were like in the past that allowed those dinosaurs to live at that time, those conditions are different today. You know, the dinosaurs were here, then they are not here, and the Earth's climate simply couldn't support the lifestyle or the presence of such gigantic creatures anymore. So the Earth's climate can change, and maybe there is something about the Earth's climate that just made it easier, made it more likely that human beings would live longer than we do today. Maybe our lifespans today are unnaturally short. Maybe we should be looking at it as though, like, why aren't we living to 147 or 175? Maybe that's actually what we should be thinking of. So I don't have a specific answer. The Bible does not give us that. It refuses to. I believe that Moses, as he's writing this, knows that he's saying something that will be interesting to people, but doesn't provide any attempt to explain it. And you have to remember also, at this point in time, it was very commonly believed that mankind used to live much longer lives in the past. You can read a number of other ancient sources documenting kings' lists or lists of people that lived far longer lifespans than what you'll read in Genesis. So the idea of human beings having been originally made to live longer than what we see around us, even what they saw on them at the time, was widespread at that point in time. But yeah, but Jacob is in his 70s when he sets out from home. Now you have to remember also that Jacob. So we think to ourselves, okay, in our culture, if you're 70, like you're in retirement age, and we might as well put you in a home somewhere and then put you in a closet and forget about you. Okay, but here is at 70, Jacob's acting like he's like 25. We would think of a young man. Again, he's often portrayed this way. Whenever you see in children's Bible books, picture Bible books or something, in Sunday school, like when you see this story depicted graphically, it's often with Jacob and Esau casting roles like 25-year-old young men, but they're actually in their 70s. Now, again, by their aging process, they might be physically more like a 40-year-old. I don't know. But they're not what we would consider young adults or young people. However, they're still very firmly under the authority of their father. Both Jacob and Esau and Rebekah are still very, very, very much under the thumb of their father Isaac. And even in their 70s, he's the clan patriarch. He is the leader. He has the authority. So that is such a wildly different. That's one of those things where it's hard for us to believe. Maybe because it just seems unbelievable, but also because our culture and our lifestyles are just so totally different from that. We have a hard time wrapping our heads around anybody actually living this way because it's so far removed from how we would choose to live. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start a new video.